As of 2023, the US pumped out an average of 21 million barrels of petroleum daily. That's more than the country's average daily consumption of around 20 million barrels, meaning there's more than enough oil produced domestically to meet US needs. Yet the US imports significant quantities of oil from other countries, especially from OPEC nations. This reliance raises questions about why the US can't leverage its own oil reserves. And finally, we've discovered the reason for this seemingly ludicrous trade. With rising energy demands and fluctuating prices, why can't the US use the oil it produces? Join us as we unravel the mystery. The dilemma of the US oil production and usage. Before we get to the crux of the matter, we need to answer a pressing question. How has the United States managed to lead the world in oil production, averaging 21 million barrels each day? This figure places it well ahead of other major producers, with Saudi Arabia and Russia second and third on the global list, each producing around 11 million barrels daily. This makes the US's output nearly double that of its closest competitors, showcasing its strong domestic oil production. How is this possible? The United States currently holds around 36.5 billion barrels of oil in its reserves. Now, 36 billion may sound like a vast supply, but in the world of oil production, it's actually modest. For comparison, Venezuela, which tops the chart for reserves, has around 302 billion barrels. Other countries with large reserves include Saudi Arabia, Canada, and Iran, each with amounts significantly greater than the US. So, how does the US manage to be the largest oil producer even with smaller reserves? The answer lies in the American approach to oil production, which prioritizes high output and immediate availability. Unlike some oil-rich countries, the US doesn't hold back its production as a strategy to control market prices. Nations like Saudi Arabia and Qatar, however, take a different path. These countries don't pump at maximum capacity daily. Instead, they manage their production to prevent an oversupply in the global market. If they produced oil at maximum rates all the time, prices would likely plummet, making it hard for these economies, which are heavily dependent on oil revenues, to maintain their economic stability. On the other hand, the US isn't as dependent on high oil prices to sustain its economy. Since the US is a major oil consumer, low prices benefit American businesses and households, making gasoline and energy more affordable across the board. This buyer-oriented perspective pushes the US to produce as much oil as possible, flooding the market to keep prices lower. Technological advancements in extraction, like hydraulic fracturing, also known as fracking, and horizontal drilling, have made it easier and faster for the US to access oil deposits. This high-output approach has transformed the US into the world's largest oil producer, even with a relatively small reserve base. However, despite this high level of production, the US is also one of the world's largest oil importers, second only to China, which means outside prices still affect the cost of oil in the country. Every day, the US imports around 6 million barrels of crude oil, while China imports about 10 million barrels. The US sources oil from numerous countries to meet its demand, including Canada, Mexico, Saudi Arabia, and Guyana, among others. In fact, about 15 different nations supply oil to the US, helping to satisfy the enormous appetite of a country that consistently ranks as the world's biggest oil consumer. In 2019, the US used around 21 million barrels of oil daily, approximately 20% of the world's total consumption, highlighting just how crucial oil is to the country's economy and daily life. Yet, while the US is bringing in millions of barrels a day, it's also one of the largest oil exporters, shipping out around 3.6 million barrels of crude each day. This volume ranks the US fourth among global oil exporters, just behind Saudi Arabia, Russia, and Iraq. On the surface, it might seem odd. Why would a country that imports so much oil also export a large portion of what it produces? Well, there is a valid reason for it, and we will be exploring it now. Why the US can't use the oil it produces. Oil is a truly global commodity, and almost no one uses it in its raw form. It must be refined into usable fuels, chemicals, or materials we rely on daily. The value and usefulness of oil depend on where it's extracted, the distance to refineries, and the physical characteristics of the crude itself. Oil varies in density, sulfur content, and viscosity. These factors affect how it's refined and where it's most cost-effective to transport and use. Therefore, the crude oil the US produces can't just be refined everywhere. So much of it ends up on the global market rather than directly serving domestic needs. This setup keeps the American economy connected to global oil flows, both buying and selling, to balance its own unique needs. In 2022, when oil and gas prices in the US began climbing sharply, many Americans saw what seemed like an obvious solution. Why not tap into the country's oil reserves to bring prices down? As mentioned earlier, the US has an estimated 38.2 billion barrels of untapped oil underground, with over 14 million acres of land and about 9 million acres offshore, leased but unused for oil extraction. So, why not drill more? The thinking went that if the US could fully tap its own oil resources, prices would fall and consumers would benefit immediately. While the idea might seem logical, as per our previous illustration, experts quickly pointed out why it wasn't that simple. In fact, it wouldn't necessarily lower local prices at all. In the US, many refineries, especially those located on the East Coast and in the Gulf of Mexico, are built to handle heavier grades of crude oil. These heavier crudes are typically imported from countries like Saudi Arabia, Venezuela, and Canada. They have a higher density and viscosity, meaning they require more complex and intensive refining processes to convert them into usable products. On the other hand, a significant portion of the oil produced domestically comes from regions like the Permian Basin and the Barnett Shale, where the extracted crude is often light and sweet. Light sweet crude has a lower density and sulfur content, making it easier and cheaper to refine into products like gasoline. As a result, much of it is exported rather than refined domestically. Heavy oil requires advanced refining processes to turn it into usable products, which is why it's generally cheaper than light oil. For instance, in recent years, heavy crude sold for about $54 per barrel on average, compared to light crude at around $70 per barrel. So, even if the US extracted all the oil it could, it wouldn't be the exact type of oil its refineries need most. Because of this mismatch, the US continues to buy significant amounts of oil from abroad, even as it produces millions of barrels each day for export. This complex system has historical roots in America's infrastructure. Most of the US oil extraction, refining, and transport facilities are located in the heartland and along the Gulf Coast, where pipelines and refineries are concentrated. This infrastructure layout is a big reason why fuel prices are often lower in states like Texas, Oklahoma, and Mississippi, where oil is produced and processed. The idea of transporting oil over long distances has been a key part of American industry since the 1860s. Early methods were rudimentary, with barrels hauled by wagons and boats. The first pipeline, a simple V-shaped channel of wooden planks, was built in 1862, stretching just a few hundred feet and relying on gravity to move the oil. A year later, Pennsylvania saw the first iron pipeline, spanning 2.5 miles with pumps to assist the flow. This is a modest distance by today's standards, but at the time, it was revolutionary. Since then, pipelines have become the primary means of transporting oil across the country, but not all regions have them. This was also because in the early 1900s, the world, including the United States, had a modest need for oil. Demand was low and oil was easy to come by. But as World War I approached, this changed rapidly. Oil began to show its unique advantages over coal. It was easier to transport, could be used in diverse types of vehicles, and provided flexibility that coal couldn't match. This adaptability gave oil a new strategic importance, particularly for military efforts. The U.S. Navy recognized this shift early on and moved to secure reliable oil resources, looking to Mexico and the Caribbean for imports. However, these supply lines proved vulnerable, especially as German U-boat attacks disrupted shipments during the war. This vulnerability sparked a drive across the United States to tap into domestic oil reserves, leading the government to prioritize oil exploration and production at home. This shift in priorities made Americans realize that oil wasn't just a commodity, it was essential for national security. To ensure efficient oil transport over long distances, especially during wartime, the U.S. Navy established the Bureau of Mines in 1910. This bureau was tasked with advancing oil extraction and refining technologies, as well as building pipelines that allowed oil to flow smoothly from one state to another. Thanks to its already existing domestic reserves, the U.S. quickly became a leading player in the global oil market. With major reserves in states like Texas and Oklahoma, the U.S. not only produced enough oil to fuel its own needs at the time, but it also became a major oil exporter, producing an impressive 70% of the world's oil by 1914. But how did the U.S. lose this position? Let's delve into the reason. How the U.S. started. Depending on oil importation. In the years that followed the war, global demand for oil only increased, and oil companies rose in importance. British, Dutch, and French corporations began expanding internationally, searching for oil wherever it could be found. Countries and corporations alike recognized oil's growing role in energy, economy, and global politics. The demand for oil continued to grow, with countries competing to access resources, redrawing maps, and reshaping diplomatic alliances based on oil reserves, particularly in the Middle East. As the world became increasingly reliant on oil, the U.S. faced a unique challenge. Despite being a major producer, it recognized the value of accessing cheaper foreign oil. By the late 1930s, the U.S. began to rely on imported oil as Middle Eastern nations, especially Saudi Arabia, ramped up production. Saudi Arabia struck oil in 1938 with the Dammam oil field, and with abundant reserves and low extraction costs, Middle Eastern nations quickly emerged as central players in the global oil market. They had two crucial advantages: massive reserves and the ability to produce oil at a much lower cost than their competitors. But simply having the oil wasn't enough. They needed a market. The industrial boom in the United States and the rising demand for oil across various sectors, from transportation to industry, created a perfect match. Middle Eastern countries supplied oil, while the US and other industrialized nations fueled demand. The economic benefits were immense, and the oil-exporting nations thrived. However, this success also brought challenges. As more countries began producing oil, competition intensified. The Soviet Union, for instance, began offering cheaper oil, and this price competition began to threaten Middle Eastern profits. In response, major oil-producing nations joined together in 1960 to form the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, OPEC. OPEC's goal was to regulate oil production among its members to maintain stable and favorable prices, preventing a race to the bottom in pricing. OPEC transformed the global oil market, giving member countries the power to influence oil prices worldwide. This coordination allowed these nations to wield significant economic and political influence. Even today, shifts in OPEC's production levels can create ripples throughout the global economy, affecting everything from fuel prices to geopolitical relations. In many ways, the modern global energy landscape is shaped by these early oil discoveries, strategic decisions, and the establishment of alliances like OPEC. So, today, we have states in the US with high fuel demand but limited pipeline infrastructure, like California and New York. These states depend on shipping, railroads, and trucking to receive fuel, which can drive up local prices. And many are wondering why the US can't just incorporate refineries that process light crude oil. While it seems like a simple thing, it's not an easy decision to make. Here's why. The challenges attached to the US refining its own oil. In 2014, the United States had nearly 160,000 miles of interstate pipelines crisscrossing the country. Yet, even with this extensive network, these pipelines don't reach everywhere. California, for example, the most populous state, has no pipeline links to other crude, oil-producing regions. While the population of California alone is larger than that of the 21 least populous states combined, making it a major consumer market, it operates almost like an oil island. Most of the oil California relies on isn't produced nearby. Instead, roughly 70% of its crude oil comes from international sources, with only a small portion imported from other US states. Why is California disconnected from the US pipeline network? The reasons boil down to a mix of geography and state policy decisions. Constructing a pipeline to connect California to the main US oil network would be costly and complex. And given the state's policies pushing toward electric vehicles and renewable energy, investing in such a pipeline doesn't appear likely. California has chosen to prioritize a shift away from fossil fuels, so there's no strong incentive to bridge the pipeline gap with other states. This brings us to a broader question. Why doesn't the US just refine its own type of oil? The decision to specialize in heavy crude refining came decades ago when US refineries were built to process oil imported from places like Mexico and Venezuela, where heavy crude is more common. This design enabled the US to secure diverse supply sources and maintain production consistency, yet it leaves the country less equipped to refine the lighter oil produced domestically. Modernizing these refineries to handle more light crude is possible, but prohibitively expensive. Updating a single refinery can cost $50 to $100 million, while a complete overhaul runs into billions. Given the 132 active refineries in the US, the total cost for a nationwide update could easily reach $130 to $200 billion, and likely more when factoring in the additional expenses that come with such extensive upgrades. Yet, few companies are eager to invest in this modernization. The government is actively working to reduce reliance on fossil fuels, encouraging a shift toward renewable energy and electric vehicles, which discourages long-term investment in oil infrastructure. As a result, buying oil from other countries has simply become more practical and profitable for the US than using all of its own oil. Imported oil, even after factoring in shipping costs, is often less expensive than US-produced oil. This discrepancy partly reflects higher land, labor, and production costs in the US than in other oil-producing regions. An added factor is the Jones Act of 1920, which mandates that goods shipped between US ports must be transported on ships that are US-built, owned, and crewed. While this law supports the American shipping industry, it adds significant costs to transporting oil domestically. Shipping crude oil from Texas to the East Coast, for instance, costs roughly 3 times more than shipping it from overseas due to Jones Act requirements. This regulation drives up the price of domestic shipping, prompting oil from Texas to head to foreign markets in Asia, while the East Coast often receives oil imported from across the Atlantic. This system of importing and exporting oil has only grown more complex in recent years. In 2020, a year marked by the pandemic, oil consumption in the US fell to around 18 million barrels per day due to decreased travel and industrial activity. But with demand rebounding, the US continues to balance both imports and exports to manage its energy requirements. And as the US strives to adapt to a changing energy landscape, this balance will likely continue, driven by factors as varied as refinery infrastructure, market economics, and the type of crude available in different regions of the world. But what are the dangers of this global dependency? Let's explore some of them. The dangers attached to the US interdependency on oil production. Imagine if the US decided to rely solely on its own oil, ignoring imports entirely. Besides the obvious logistical challenges, the shift would lead to higher prices and inefficiencies in both refining and transport. The structure of the US oil market and the interdependencies it maintains with global producers means that while the US drills and refines its oil, it will continue to rely on both domestic and international sources to meet demand efficiently. But what's the downside of this interdependence? It has been tested once, and it became particularly clear in the 1970s how imports helped stabilize the US economy. One key event that brought these challenges into sharp focus was the 1973 oil embargo. During the Yom Kippur War, the United States supported Israel, a stance that angered many oil-producing Arab nations. In response, these nations imposed an embargo, halting oil exports to the US almost overnight. This sudden disruption threw the American economy into crisis, as the country's heavy reliance on foreign oil left it vulnerable to international conflicts beyond its control. Gasoline shortages, skyrocketing fuel prices, and a newfound awareness of the limitations of US energy policy forced the country to rethink its approach. In response, President Richard Nixon took to the airwaves, addressing the nation on the energy crisis and the need to reduce dependence on foreign oil. He emphasized that securing America's energy supply was essential to both economic stability and national security. To tackle this, the Nixon administration launched several new initiatives, including Project Independence, which aimed for US energy self-sufficiency by 1980. This ambitious project marked a shift in federal energy policy, leading to the establishment of the Energy Policy Office and the Federal Energy Administration, FEA, both tasked with overseeing petroleum prices, coordinating national energy policy, and allocating resources during shortages. Additionally, Nixon imposed temporary price controls on petroleum products, hoping to shield consumers from price shocks. These controls, though helpful in the short term, turned out to be difficult to maintain and even contributed to long-term supply issues. Price caps made it less profitable for oil companies to invest in production, worsening the very scarcity they were intended to solve. This experience underscored how deeply U.S. energy needs were tied to its broader economic and geopolitical priorities. Even after the embargo ended, the need for foreign oil remained, and energy independence proved elusive. Over time, U.S. energy policy evolved in response to changing market dynamics and technological advancements. The rise of domestic oil production, spurred by innovations like hydraulic fracturing and horizontal drilling, transformed the U.S. into a major oil producer yet again. How did the U.S. achieve this level of advancement in the extraction process? Technologies involved in keeping the U.S. position as the largest oil producer. The extraction of oil from these unconventional U.S. reserves, particularly through techniques like hydraulic fracturing or fracking, has transformed the U.S. oil landscape. Fracking involves injecting high-pressure fluid into the ground to fracture rock formations, allowing oil and gas to flow more freely. This method became popular in the early 2000s and has significantly increased the U.S. oil supply, enabling the country to reduce its dependence on foreign oil. One key figure in this transformation was Michael P. Mitchell, who introduced horizontal drilling techniques. This innovation greatly improved extraction rates and played a crucial role in turning the Barnett Shale into the largest onshore natural gas field in the United States. Today, the Barnett Shale remains a vital contributor to the nation's energy supply, providing a significant portion of domestic natural gas. The techniques developed in the U.S. for extracting oil and gas from unconventional reserves are now being applied around the world, illustrating the country's influence on global energy markets. However, it's important to note that fracking is a controversial practice. In many parts of the world, it faces criticism due to environmental concerns, including potential damage to ecosystems and the impact on local communities. Despite these concerns, the U.S. continues to utilize fracking technology to boost its oil production, which has led to a complex interplay of domestic energy needs and environmental considerations. How does this extraction process work? The origins of fracking date back to the 1860s, when explosives, such as nitroglycerin, were used to stimulate oil wells. This early method laid the groundwork for what would evolve into modern fracking techniques. The technique we recognize today began taking shape in the late 1940s, thanks to pioneering work by Floyd Ferris in 1947. Fracking has enabled increased extraction rates of water, petroleum, and natural gas from deep underground, unlocking resources in areas where traditional extraction methods would not work effectively. In the United States, fracking has led to a notable surge in domestic oil production, which has helped reduce the country's reliance on foreign oil. This rise in production has not only boosted the economy, but also supported local economies, particularly in regions that have historically depended on traditional industries. States like Ohio and Pennsylvania have experienced job growth and economic stability due to this innovation in extraction technology. However, while fracking has its advantages, it also raises significant environmental concerns. For instance, the process consumes vast amounts of water, which poses risks to drinking water sources. Additionally, there are worries about methane emissions, which can contribute to climate change, and the potential for fracking to induce minor earthquakes. These concerns have sparked heated debates about the industry's effects on the environment and public health. On a global scale, fracking has influenced oil and gas prices, by tapping into previously unreachable reserves, increasing the overall supply of fossil fuels. To maintain consistent oil production, U.S. refineries have adapted to primarily process heavy and medium sour crude imported from countries like Saudi Arabia, along with a smaller amount of light sweet crude from domestic sources. Despite the substantial advancements made in oil production techniques like fracking, achieving self-sufficiency in oil production in the U.S. remains a complicated task. The technical and financial barriers are significant, suggesting that oil imports will continue to play an important role in the American oil industry for the foreseeable future. This ongoing reliance on both domestic and foreign oil highlights the challenges of transitioning to a more sustainable energy future while balancing economic interests and environmental responsibilities. How the U.S. is adopting newer rules for energy production. The U.S. government has long supported its energy industry through subsidies, which are financial incentives aimed at fostering domestic energy production and stabilizing prices. When energy prices rise sharply, it impacts the average American directly, from higher gas prices to increased heating and electricity costs. Additionally, most recessions in recent decades have been linked to spikes in oil prices, highlighting the economic vulnerability associated with energy costs. To mitigate these risks and promote a stable energy supply, the government provides a range of subsidies designed to encourage energy production and reduce reliance on foreign oil. One of the main forms of subsidy in the oil and gas industry comes from specific tax incentives built into the tax code. A major incentive is the Intangible Drilling Costs (IDC) deduction, which allows companies to write off significant costs associated with drilling within the first year. This is especially beneficial for fracking companies, where much of the expense is incurred early in the project. The White House budget for fiscal year 2025 estimates that the IDC tax break will benefit the oil and gas industry by about $1.7 billion in 2025, with total expected benefits reaching $9.7 billion by 2034. The U.S. government also provides the depletion allowance, a subsidy that allows companies to account for the diminishing reserves in their wells by reducing their tax burdens, similar to depreciation for other businesses. The depletion allowance is expected to provide the oil and gas industry with $880 million in benefits in 2025, amounting to around $15.7 billion by 2034. These subsidies are similar in principle to those available for renewable energy, such as wind and solar tax credits, which provide an estimated $11 billion annually. This level of support for renewable energy reflects a shift in U.S. policy towards cleaner energy, as seen in the government's growing focus on green technologies. The way subsidies are calculated and understood varies. For instance, beyond direct subsidies like tax breaks, the International Monetary Fund, IMF, also considers implicit subsidies. These are indirect costs related to environmental harm and health issues resulting from fossil fuel production and consumption. According to the IMF, total U.S. fossil fuel subsidies, including implicit ones, surpassed $750 billion in 2022. Although direct subsidies only made up around $3 billion of this total, the remainder reflects broader societal costs that are not directly paid by energy companies but affect public health and environmental quality. If energy companies were to bear these costs directly, the price of fossil fuel production would likely increase significantly. The debate over subsidies for fossil fuels is politically charged, as subsidies are provided not only to the oil industry but also to renewables, agriculture, and other sectors. The government's role in subsidizing industries hinges on what it aims to promote within society. Subsidies for renewable energy are essential to help these newer industries become competitive. Established industries like oil and gas already have extensive infrastructure and market control, which newer renewable companies must compete against. The US has mainly used tax incentives to support renewable energy expansion, and over time, this approach has led to notable growth in wind and solar power across the country. A significant boost for renewables came with the Inflation Reduction Act, passed in 2022. This legislation allocated $369 billion to address climate change, with $270 billion in the form of tax incentives for clean energy. These incentives are expected to make renewable energy more cost-competitive, enabling it to compete more effectively with fossil fuels. The Congressional Budget Office and Joint Committee on Taxation project that the IRA could cost the U.S. government $660 billion through 2031, rising to $790 billion by 2033, mainly due to tax credits. In comparison, the subsidies for oil and gas, such as those associated with intangible drilling costs, are projected to cost $9.7 billion between 2025 and 2034. This substantial difference reflects the government's increasing commitment to renewable energy and a shift away from traditional fossil fuel subsidies. Critical to this transition are the renewable energy industry's investment tax credit and production tax credit, both of which received boosts under the Inflation Reduction Act. These credits have been instrumental in expanding wind and solar power in the US for over 30 years, providing the necessary support for renewables to grow and sustain themselves in the energy market. As renewable energy continues to develop, balancing energy policy between fossil fuels and clean energy remains challenging. Moving away from oil and gas dependency involves reducing traditional subsidies while expanding support for renewables. Whether the US can sustain and expand its renewable infrastructure while ensuring a stable, affordable energy supply for Americans will depend largely on continued government support and strategic industry partnerships. This intricate balance will play a central role in the future of US energy independence and environmental policy. Thanks for watching. See you in our next video.